So we've started?
Yes, you can call.
Okay,
call the meeting.
calling the meeting to order at, what time is it? 7:04. With Yaslin Daniels, myself, Jack Goldstein, and Sue Mayer. And Matt Francisco online. So I'm going to not report on Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail tonight. We'll take that up again at the first of the year. I do want to report that I've been reappointed chair. So there you are, a mixed blessing for everyone. And let's move immediately to the minutes so we can then turn to John's presentation to us. Is everyone present here able to either put a motion on the table and second and or vote for the minutes of 10/13/20?
I have as of 10/13, everyone.
Yeah, everyone was
is
there.
able
Okay,
to
then
vote. Let me just check again. Jack, Sue, Yaslin, Laura, and Matt was remote. Yeah, so that's 10/13 is everybody. And I think November 10th, Yaslin, you were not here.
okay, then everyone has had plenty of time to review these. And pending any comments tonight, may I have a resolution to approve the minutes of 10/13, please? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yaslin, a second, please. Second, Sue, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. No opposed and no abstentions. And then, Sue or Matt, may I have a resolution to approve the 11/10 minutes?
Do we have to have 3 people here or,
Oh, shit.
or, no? Okay.
No, you can vote.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Only
so we can
three
do
here.
business. Okay, so
So
moved. Matt, can you give me a second, please?
Seconded.
Thank you. And all those in favor?
I,
Aye, that's 2 and 1 abstention?
yeah,
Okay. All right, so having concluded our business, let's turn over to John. This presentation by John on the SECRA is the 4th hour of our required, except for Lara, who will take it before the first of the year, of our required 4 hours of professional training that the state requires for members of the planning board and members of the zoning review board. And
Let me just make sure. Matt, are you seeing this?
No, I mean, I have the presentation if you want to just tell me what page you're sharing it.
John sent it to.
Okay,
Well, you probably want to share it anyway for the recording, right?
hold on,
Okay.
hold on.
All right, well, let me yabber on. The first 3 hour
There's the share button.
Yeah.
sessions were given
On
online,
the right, the share button. There you go, right there.
were given
Okay.
online by the New York Conference of Mayors and dealt with basics of planning and zoning and short-term rentals.
And cannabis, cannabis
Drug.
laws.
yeah.
Oh, did you take
Drugstore.
cannabis?
Yes.
I didn't take it.
I took
Did you?
that,
Okay.
You took a class on Canada.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, yes, class on cannabis.
Okay, and
It's all
then.
evil
now, I guess go
Yes,
back.
I know.
Oh, village talk.
Okay, so let us turn this over to you, John, okay?
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see everybody again. I know it's been a while. And I apologize. I know I was supposed to come earlier in the month, but it's been quite crazy the last 2 months. it always is the end of the year, and you figure I'd learn it by now. I've been doing this for over 20 years, but it's just November and December are not fun, work-wise. So in any event, we're gonna talk, I did a little presentation about the State Environmental Quality Review Act. I'm really just gonna cover the portions that don't involve an environmental impact statement. So we're not gonna cover that. You as a board will probably never come across an environmental impact statement. They're for very large projects, indirectly with the Fjord Trail, that, you know, it's probably coming up in that capacity. But I'm just, as a board, you know, you probably don't have to worry about overseeing the preparation of an environmental impact statement. Perhaps with the marathon site is probably the only thing I can think of if that gets developed. But who knows? So I'm just gonna focus really on, I kind of catered it to the smaller actions that you guys see on a monthly basis. So that way, you know, hopefully like, take a few tidbits and, you know, be able to apply them for next year. So, so the first sheet, the history of the State Environmental Quality Review Act. So the state legislation that was passed, I think it was in 1972 or 3, is actually Article 8 of the New York State Environmental Conservation Law. And then what we call SEQRA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, is actually the regulations. So just the basic 101, the state legislators, they enact legislation, and then various agencies enact rules and regulations in accordance with those regulations. So the Department of Environmental Conservation oversaw the enactment of the regulations with respect to the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Just like the DOT has regulations for state highways, Department of Health has regulations with respect to legislation regarding health. So the law, although it was passed in 74, it was phased in, and it was not until 1978 that it took full effect. So the purpose of the act is to consider environmental factors early in the planning stages of an action that are directly undertaken, funded, or approved by any local, like a village, regional, like a county, or state agencies. These projects can be modified as needed to avoid adverse impacts on the environment. So the idea is to talk about the issues early on in the conceptual stage, so that it should lead to constructive modifications, mitigation measures. I always kind of talk, it's like a give and take process. I do a lot of work for developers, and you know, it's really like a negotiation, almost going back and forth. An agency cannot undertake, fund, or approve an action until it complies with SEQRA. So it's a big procedural step. So substantively, you guys look at site plan applications and the site plan criteria, or subdivision applications. That's kind of like the substance. SEQRA is actually a procedural step. So that has to be taken. The SEQRA determination has to be made before you can act on the substance of the application, which would be the site plan approval or subdivision approval. And feel free to ask any questions, or if you guys want to wait till after, that's fine too.
What do you prefer? To have that already?
Okay. That's fine. It's your preference. So,
You want to go back to the others?
Well, no, let's go through it.
okay, we'll go through it.
That'd
So,
be nice to hear the question in context, though.
Yes, okay. So question number 1 is there any role for the federal government in setting the requirements for state regulations? And do they have any continuing oversight in terms of the application of those regulations?
no, so the federal government has their own National Environmental Policy Act, which is, it's a federal SEQRA. In fact, I guess they call this most states have their own, they call them little NEPAs. So the federal government, there's no funding. I don't think every state even has to enact their own state, their own little NEPA. I'm sure there's a lot of states out west or, where they, it's a free for all.
So when would a federal let's say, I mean, we're talking about the Fjord Trail,
Right.
or at least I'm thinking about it. And
So is there a federal agency involved? That's when
Exactly.
NEPA would kick in, the National Environmental Policy Act.
okay, so for instance, the the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or the Army Corps of Engineers.
Well, no, because the Army Corps, because you couldn't have, I have projects that are state projects that are subject to Army Corps of Engineer for wetlands that don't require a national environmental policy, a NEPA.
But does the Army Corps have to?
They might have
determine
some-
the certificate of no effect?
Yeah, so now the Army Corps works with the DEC because it's a joint application when you have a wetlands permit. So maybe as part of their interagency overlap, maybe Army Corps says, all right, we'll be subject, as long as you guys have your own state environmental quality review act, the national one doesn't apply.
Okay.
I'm kind of guessing.
Yeah. Okay. Did you have one?
No.
No, okay. On B and I guess the next page. Who determines early? In the sense that with the Fjord Trail, we already have approval and soon to start construction on part of it. Now, it was segmented out,
Right.
but the environmental impacts from that can't be segmented out. So who is it, the lead agency that determines what is early in terms
Correct.
of when it's done?
Correct.
Okay, and it says early in the planning stages of action, so we now have a master plan that is more or less complete.
For the Fjord Trail you're talking
Yes, for the
Mhm.
Fjord Trail. There was a scoping document, but there was no EIS that led to the development of the master plan.
Correct. So although the master plan in some cases sometimes master plans are considered generic environmental impact statements, but I don't think that was the case here because I think they're working on a generic environmental impact
correct.
statement right now.
That's correct. So I'm not asking.
So
for-
there are some planning tools. If the planning tool doesn't commit the agency to a definite course or action, then those may be exempt from secret. I was gonna hit that later.
Okay.
And that might be the case with that master plan.
Okay, but again, on number B. So Phillipstown, the town of Phillipstown, the Board of Trustees at Phillipstown cannot approve the Fjord Trail if it's in their authority to approve it until after the environmental impact statement is done.
Yes, you need a final environmental impact statement.
Okay. And bias in favor of the project in a formal meeting doesn't meet that qualification of approval.
What do you mean bias? Like,
I mean that a member of the Phillipstown board said at the first public meeting when this was unveiled back in April, I don't need any more information. I wish I could approve this now.
okay. Well, so the first question is, do they have an actual approval authority?
That's correct. And
When
that,
he says approve,
yes,
he or she may not understand that. And we still don't know because we don't know the details of the trail and the possible implications. So, but yeah, you should, as a board, and this could be a whole nother subject, You should never prejudge anything for good or bad.
And that's what my point is, yes. Exactly. Okay, why don't
That,
you,
that could be a whole other another lecture, by the
yeah,
way.
no, I understand.
Conflicts of
It's just
interest.
the concept of pre-approval for the good gets left out of conversation very often when it's just as
Right.
an issue. Okay. All right, so continue. Thank you.
Okay, so page 3, the preliminary steps in the secret process. I mean, first, just to confirm what agencies are subject to secret. And again, it's at all levels, state agencies like the Department of Health, local agencies like high schools, villages, towns, even like industrial development agencies. And the village board, planning board, zoning board, and even the HDRB, all those types of agencies are subject to secret. Now, secret does not apply to the recommendations of an agency. So I don't know, you guys might have like a tree advisory board, anything that's just advisory.
Mhm.
I've seen tree advisory boards, like whenever you refer stuff to the county planning board under 239M, that's just advisory. There was actually a case on that because somebody tried to sue the county, but the county's like, wait a second, we don't make any final actions. We don't make final determinations. We just advise. So anything that's in an advisory capacity is not subject to secret. So if you refer something over to the tree advisory board for a recommendation, they don't have to comply with secret. The first real step in the process, for the planning board's sake, because you guys know you're an agency, you already know that you're an agency subject to secret. The first step is to determine if it's an action, and I'm putting quotes, subject to secret. All discretionary decisions of an agency to approve, fund, or directly undertake an action that may affect the environment are subject to secret. So the definition of action includes, it's either projects or physical activities such as construction. I mean, that's the one we kind of think of that may affect the environment. That's the one we think of the most. So it's any projects or physical activities either undertaken by the agency themselves. Let's say the village wants to build a new village hall and build it from scratch. That would be subject to secret. Or involves funding by the agency. Let's say the village wants to fund somebody else to build something, where they're asking, usually that comes up with like the environmental control facilities, from the state. The state is funding a lot of stuff. That's any funding is subject to secret. Or whether you're giving or providing any approvals, which in your case, site plan, special use site plan and subdivision approvals. The approvals you give are considered actions. Now, the second type of action is agency planning and policy making activities that may affect the environment and commit the agency to a definite course of future decisions. So there could be some white papers or policies or guidelines, and maybe they're not really committing an agency to a future action. Those would not, but I would say like the village comprehensive plan. That sets the framework for your zoning. That sets a definite course of action. That is certainly subject to secret.
And so is the master plan, obviously, because they're holding a EIS on it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, and the third type of action is the adoption of any agency rules, regulations, and procedures. For instance, when the village adopts some local laws that affect the environment. Obviously, any of the zoning laws would be subject to secret. Not every single local law they adopt is technically subject to secret, but I would say I always err on the side of caution. I always say it's better to have some secret than no secret at all, because you can never know. You could be, I can't think of an example, but not every local law is subject to secret, but I think I usually have most municipalities that I represent do secret with a local law. And so those are the three examples of actions under secret. And again, it has to be a discretionary decision, meaning you have some discretion in site plan approval because you're looking at a set of criteria, and you guys with your expertise are determining whether, you know, traffic, noise, lighting, whether those issues, landscaping, have been addressed. So you have some discretion. Now, when the building inspector issues a building permit to build a house, or even to build any of the buildings over by the old hospital, Butterfield, there's no discretion in that. When a building permit is basically, here's my plans, I meet the New York State Building Code, give me my building permit. There's no discretion, you know, for the building inspector. So those are not, like, issuing building permits are not subject to secret. Go on to the next page. So here's some examples. So common discretionary actions include zoning changes, subdivision approvals, site plan variances, special use permits, and like I said, adoption of most local laws. All right, so the next step 2. What is the classification of the action being analyzed? So there's 3 different classifications in secret. So once you determine that it's an action subject to secret, okay, how do we classify this action? So you have what's called type 1 actions, and they're more likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment than other classes of action. So these are the bigger ones. So let me just go through some samples. Like, for instance, and I don't think you guys are really ever going to come across these, quite honestly, like the alteration of 10 acres or more for a project. Where is it? The sale, if the village sold or bought or leased 100 or more contiguous acres. Adopting a zoning code, you know, from scratch. You don't have a zoning code, you adopt a zoning code, that's a type 1 action. Some of the threshold parking, a non-residential structure that requires like 500 parking spaces. Another non-residential structure that's 100,000 square feet or more. So those would be type 1 actions. Those are big actions. Any structures exceeding 100 feet.
100 feet, what, height?
Yeah, height without in a municipality without any zoning regulations. So you guys wouldn't come across that one. That's not a good example. So those types of actions you're really not going to see. Now there are some type 1 actions, and I don't know. Going to jump ahead. Yeah, so there are some type 1 actions where you guys might come across, because the village of Cold Spring is unique because a lot of it's in a national historic district. So as a type 1 action, if I'm sorry, but if you what's the language here? Okay, so if the action is within or substantially contiguous to a historic district or historic building. And there's cases that say substantially contiguous is right across the street, diagonal, obviously right next door. That means the thresholds that I kind of were citing before are lowered by 25%. Meaning, all right, it's not 500 spaces, but it's 25, you know, whatever 25% is of 500, which like 100 and something. Right. So the threshold, so when you're in a historic district or you're contiguous to an historic district, then the threshold, the type 1 thresholds, all of them are lowered. So it's a lower bar because there's more of a potential for impact because you're in a historic district. So, and the same goes if you're in an agricultural district adjoining or next to, as well as a park. So when you have historic agriculture or parklands, the thresholds in the type 1 actions all get lowered by 25%. No matter what. So instead of 10 acres of alteration, it's only 2.5 acres of alteration. Again, because there's a heightened sense, given the proximity to the historic district or parkland or an ag district.
Where does a determination of environmental impact, an area of environmental impact, come into helping to define, excuse me, continuity or abutting of a historic resource, for instance? And again, my experience is in the city, but in the city, there was a process where there was a fund set up called a payment in lieu of taxes, which was sequestered for environmental remediation and or new constructive projects. And the catchment area of that pilot was determined by the environmental impact of the project. And I'm not a lawyer, but that's loosely what it was. So when does that determination of area of environmental impact come in? So that a project like the Fjord Trail, which may be across, depending on how the final boundaries are drawn, may be across the street from a historic district.
Right.
It's going through parkland. When does that, who makes the determination, and when it is done, whether it actually meets those
Classifications.
Yeah.
So the lead agency makes the classification. And again, the language it specifically says occurring wholly or partially within or substantially contiguous. So, and again, there were cases where they kind of define what is substantially contiguous. That's just for the classification. Now, I think your question is more in the sense of when we study the impacts. So let's say you're close to a historic structure, but you're not substantially contiguous. So you haven't triggered the lower thresholds, but it doesn't mean you ignore the historic structure that's 2 blocks, that's half a block down as opposed to right next door. And that we'll cover later when you go through the criteria of whether you need an environmental impact statement or not. I think your question was more towards, so those are type 1 action. Now the the regulations also list type 2 action. And basically type 2 actions have been found by the DEC when they put these regulations together to not have a significant adverse impact on the environment. And they're essentially exempt from any further secret review. So when you have a type 2 action, you're not required to make any secret determination. You don't need a neg deck. You don't need a final environmental impact statement. Once you classify it as a type 2, that's the end of it. You're done and secret is finished. Now, that doesn't mean, you still have to review your site plan. You still have to look at traffic. You still have to look at lighting and noise. So just because you classify something as type 2 doesn't mean you cannot bring up, environmental issues. You can still look at the criteria for site plan review. A lot of it overlaps with the criteria we'll talk about later on when you determine significance. So just because you classify something as a type 2 doesn't mean you still can't raise some environmental issues. And the list is in the statute, and I'll give you some examples. So type 2 actions. is, replacement, rehabbing or reconstruction of a facility in kind. So if you're just demo or renovating a building, that's a type 2 action. Repaving highways, type 2 action. Now this one's an interesting one. I use this a lot as a developer. The construction or expansion of a primary or accessory non-residential structure or facility involving less than 4,000 square feet of gross floor area, not involving a change in zoning and consistent with local land use control. So, for instance, I worked on the, like putting a bank on a pad site within the Home Depot shopping center. The bank, those little banks are only a few thousand square feet. So it was less than 4,000 square feet. It was something that was permitted by site plan approval and it was consistent with the local land use plan. So they classified it as a type 2 action, even though it was, we're building something, but the DEC is saying, whatever you're building here does not rise to the level of requiring an environmental impact statement.
The expansion of Food Town when the post office left.
Correct. As long as it's less than 4,000 square feet, it should be classified as a type 2 action. Anything that has to do with a single family home, those are type 2 actions, whether you're constructing one, whether you need a variance, those are definitely type 2 actions. Anything with respect to like, this is really more for the zoning board, but if somebody comes in for a variance for a deck or a shed, any accessory structures to a residential home, those are all type 2 actions. This one is a new one, which I think I've applied this one a lot to a lot of your, so anything where you reuse of a commercial structure or structure containing mixed residential commercial uses. So any of these buildings along Main Street, I'd say with this new language, new being, I think it's about 4 or 5 years old, then those are all type 2 actions. If you have one business leaving and another one coming in, they're just reusing the existing space. So those are type 2 actions. Official acts of a ministerial nature involving no exercise of discretion. So those are the building permits where there's no discretion. Now, permits from the historic preservation, with the way your code is written for the historic district regulations, there's discretion for your HDRB. So their actions are subject to secra, which they follow and comply with. There are some situations in some municipalities where historic permits are issued by the building inspector. Again, it's basically, here's X, Y, and Z, you have to approve my permit. There's no discretion. So when you're talking about historic permits for historic structures, I would say most of them are probably subject to secret, but you might have some examples where they're not, where there's no discretion issuing a historic preservation permit. Adoptions of moratoriums on land development or construction. So I think the village, sometimes municipalities adopt moratoriums. For instance, 20 years ago when cell towers first became popular, municipalities didn't know how to regulate them. So they put a moratorium, meaning they put a stop on any processing of any cell tower applications. And in the interim, they would develop these regulations on how to regulate cell towers. So the act of stopping the review and approval process for something is a type 2 action, not subject to secra. Any interpretation of the zoning code. So if the building inspector has to issue an interpretation, or if the ZBA has to decide on an interpretation, those are type 2 actions, not subject to secra. So those are just some samples. So the third classification, and the statute lists all the type 1, the regulations list all the type 1. They list all the type 2 actions. They're all right there in the regulations. And if you're not a type 1 or a type 2, then you're classified as an unlisted. And that's just, if you're not 1 or 2, you're unlisted. And we'll talk about the distinction in a second about that. Do you have any questions on the classification?
I can see myself having questions as applications arise based on some of the explanations that you've drawn here, because I'm not sure that I understand when something is discretionary and when it's not discretionary, if there is as you said, what appears to be a negotiation going on that results in changes. So,
Well, everything that you guys, any site plan and subdivision,
yes,
those are all discretionary.
those are all discretionary. Okay,
So those are all subject to secret.
okay.
And
Okay,
John,
so the next, on page 9, the organization, yeah, I kind of talked about all that stuff, yeah.
Matt, did you have a question?
yeah, I was just curious as we consider this stuff, when the lead agency is state parks and the applicant is the state as well, does all of this apply the same way, or is there room?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because it's almost like what is the phrase, the fox guarding the hen house?
Absolutely.
It happens all the time, and I think there's been some cases trying to challenge that, but the DEC has basically said, they're undertaking the project, the regulations say undertake. So it happens if a town wants to build a new town hall, if they want to build a new recreation center, they are generally the lead agency. It's their project, and you would hope that they would go through the right process. An open public comment period would kind of keep them honest. But there have been cases on people complaining about the very same thing where, how can we trust these guys, this lead agency, when they're the ones undertaking the project, when they're the ones that are pushing for the projects. But there's been challenges, but the DEC has said, nope, this is how it is in the regulations. And I think for the most part, most agencies that undertake, do a good job, and there's a public component that keeps them honest for the most part. It's not perfect, but I think generally it usually works out.
But so technically, it is supposed to apply to them no different than just any member of the public under review.
Correct. Yeah, they're subject to the same regulations as if a private developer was trying to build this linear this walkway.
I guess what I have trouble understanding is that, the work that went on in the shoreline stabilization, and then what appears to be the construction of a ramp, right, that likely leads to the connector, right? There's a landmass that was brought up to go up over the tracks. Clearly, it looks like significant engineering to produce a ramp. But I don't understand how the review could have gotten them that far. But I guess that's probably having faith in the process.
Yeah, so again, I'm not too sure of the details, are you talking about down by Dockside?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know the mayor has reached out a ton of times trying to get, the correct answer, but I don't really, I don't know their basis for whatever minimal work they did. Maybe it's something they would have done regardless. I just don't know. But technically you're not supposed to do anything until you complete secret.
And there was no CEQA done on Dockside, was there?
That's my point, is that when you go down there and you look to the far right in the spot back where the restaurant used to be, there is a ramp that was built, right? A land ramp that one would assume is going to be the beginning of the connector, right? To get over the tracks. But it just doesn't follow that there's no seeker and it doesn't follow that there are no plans, because obviously the engineering for something like that is pretty involved. Just wanted to see what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't explain why they maneuvered why they left it the way they did.
So for no environmental review, no further environmental review to take place on Dockside, it would have either had to have been declared a type 2 or a type 1 and a negative declaration declared, correct?
Yes, but I don't know how far along they are with the engineering. I don't think they
Completed.
know what they're doing.
It's
quite honestly.
completed. The Dockside project is
Oh, the
completed.
project itself, the
Yeah,
Dockside project. Yeah.
And the village has, as you know, has now taken over management of that by the agreement. But I can't find any evidence of any environmental. You have to use the word review advisedly, because you can review something and it can lead you to not doing anything more. But I'm trying to figure out, as Matt's pointing out, that those were not minor changes that took place at Dockside.
Mhm.
There was a boat ramp put in, concrete boat ramp, which they said was replacing an existing boat ramp, but that's sort of like saying, building on a cemetery is not going to have any effect.
Well, I mean, if it's replacing, then there was type 2 action does talk about replacing.
Okay, but that's only one element of it. The berm, the earth berm, the ramp is a brand new bit of engineering. And so in trying to figure out what environmental review took place, again, in order for it to have occurred the way it occurred, there would have had to have been a determination of a type 1 action and then a negative deck declared, or it would have had to have been determined a type 2 action, no further review necessary.
Right, well, it could be unlisted. So remember, so unlisted actions, you also have to go through the secret process. They're just not presumed to be, they're not as likely to require an environmental impact statement.
Well, but the purpose of the shoreline stabilization was in fact to be impactful in a positive way, according to the designers of it. But it was meant to make change, to have an impact on a parkland. So
On the environment,
Huh?
on the environment.
On
The
the environment. So I'm not sure how it would be unlisted. And I'm,
Well, so
anyway,
when I say unlisted,
Yeah.
it's meaning it doesn't fall within a type 1 category. It doesn't fall within the type 2 category. So it is subject to secret. It's just not one of the type 1 actions.
okay, but if it were subject to secra, then there would have to be some record of a.
Yes, there should have been something,
Okay.
even if it was you should always have a record of the classification, even if you say this is type 2. I always put it in the
Oh,
resolution.
no, I know you could have been, yeah.
You should have a record of that. Because at least then you were thinking, okay, and here's our reasoning why.
Okay.
So I'm not familiar with the documentation that led to the whatever improvements they made.
Okay.
So it's hard for me to guess. But it sounds like maybe they argued they were type 2. I don't really know. Maybe
But
they
the
were listed action.
But the shoreline stabilization, this is discrete from the shoreline stabilization. That ramp has nothing to do with the shoreline stabilization. But I guess but I wonder though, when the state doesn't have to pull a permit, right? And doesn't have to comply with local code, I don't, typically, obviously, we know that the process is you need to get your neg deck, you need to go through the process to then get your permit. But if you don't need a permit and you're the lead agency as well as the applicant classifying the action, I'm concerned that things don't really go the same way.
Well,
Right.
Parks might not need to issue itself a permit, but it's still funding the whatever project. So the act of funding also triggers secra. And state agencies, they may be exempt from local zoning, but they are not exempt from secra.
So who would have been the lead agency on the review of the shoreline stabilization with the village as the licensee on the park?
Parks?
Dockside Park.
Parks would have been, because the agreement was that Parks would undertake and pay for all of the capital changes. And when they were completed, there would be a transfer and the village would take over the maintenance of,
Right.
of the park. So I don't think there was anyone else involved except Parks who made those changes.
Gotcha.
And we'll talk in a second about coordinator review and involved in.
Okay,
And
why
lead
don't we
agencies.
move on to that one?
Okay, so the next step after you classify is to figure out what other agencies need to issue permits, what other agencies are involved in funding a project. So that's the next step. So when you have so the distinction between a type 1 and unlisted action, so both are subject to secret, whether you're type 1 or unlisted. Now remember, type 1 is something that's more likely to require an EIS. But a type 1 action requires the submission of a long environmental assessment form. And that's a form that an applicant fills out and provides kind of qualitative data about the project and about the property. And you also have to do what's called coordinated review. So if you have a type 1 action and you have multiple agencies that have to issue permits, whether it's the DEC, the New York State Department of Transportation, as well as the planning board, then you, as a planning board, you have to coordinate and somebody has to issue a notice of intent to be lead agency. And that's basically you send a notice with the application materials that you have to date to the other agencies, whether it's the DEC, whether it's the zoning board, it could be any level of government, Army Corps of Engineers, and say, hey, we've got this project before the planning board. We see that you also have to issue a permit. It's a type 1 action. We have to do coordinated review. We are expressing interest in being the lead agency. And that's called like a lead agency intent for lead agency designation. And normally after 30 days, if nobody responds, in most cases, you're not going to have many struggles or fights over who the lead agency is. There are a couple of examples, and the statute and the regulations actually cover instances where you have these lead agency disputes where, if you say you guys were circulating for lead agency and another agency said, hey, wait a second, we want to be the lead agency. And then there's a whole process you go through as far as, you go to the DEC and there's a bunch of factors they look at. I'm not really going to get into that because it's very rare when you have a lead agency dispute. So if you, after 30 days, if nobody responds, then whoever circulates and whoever wants to be lead, the person that circulated to be lead agency then becomes lead agency. The other agencies they're issuing permits. They're called involved agencies. They're still involved in the process. They still get copied on all of your secret steps that you guys take. But they're not going to issue any of their permits until you guys finish your secret. So it's coordinated. You guys are taking the lead as far as secret. They could provide comments. I've had that happen a lot where not so much like, well, actually DEC does issue letters sometimes. But like if a village board is the lead agency on a rezone, they'll certainly get comments from a planning board. As an involved agency, you are issuing permits, but you can't issue those permits until the lead agency finishes their secret review. Now, when you have an unlisted action, again, remember that's something that's it's smaller. It's not quite a type 2, so it's still subject to secret. You're not required to do coordinated review. So if you have a project here where somebody also needs variances, but it's only unlisted action, you can do your own secret. And the applicant kind of will then proceed to the zoning board, where the zoning board will do its own separate secret. So you kind of run the risk of having conflicting, you know, what if one board issues a neg deck and the other issues a pos deck? That's very rare. It's not uncommon to do uncoordinated review, especially on smaller unlisted actions when you're not dealing, you know, with very large projects, you know, projects that are just above the type 2 threshold. But it is a risk for developers that you could have different secret determinations by the zoning board and the planning board. You have the option to do coordinated review, so you can always, as a board, do coordinated review, even if it's an unlisted action. I know some boards just do that as a matter of course, and that's fine. And the other thing with a unlisted action, you are allowed to submit what's called a short environmental assessment form. So that again just provides qualitative data on the application materials on the property, and it's only a 3-page document as opposed to the long form, which is, you know, 15, 20 pages.
That's what we usually get
On the short forms.
on the short one, yeah.
Right.
And that almost always accompanies an application to us.
It should. So even if it's a type 2 action, if I'm representing an applicant and I know it's a type 2, I'll still do the short form EAF, and in the cover letter, I'll just say, hey, I'm just giving this to you guys for you to review, but I think it's a type 2 action because of, you know, X, Y, and Z. That way they have it for the records, and, you know, I think it makes it easier to make the determination. And, you know, it's most of the projects, you know, these aren't going to be, they're not going to trigger environmental impact statements. Most of the projects you're going to get. So if you don't want to classify the type 2, I'm not going to fight you as an applicant, because I know that, you know, my project for the 10,000 square foot restaurant is not going to trigger environmental impact statement, or it shouldn't legally. Some people like to try to issue positive declarations to kill projects, but so it is done, but not legally.
But where does Endangered Species Act connect with in the EAF process? In other words, you know, you can have a type 2, I assume, by reason of its relatively small size, or even that it fits under the category. But let's say there's a bald eagle nest. Where does that come in if you're not doing an environmental, you know?
An environmental review.
Yeah.
It depends. So if you need a permit from the DEC, even if it's a type 2, then the DEC will look at it. But if you don't need a permit from the DEC, it may not come in.
Okay, because I'm reaching back, Matt, to the Dunkin' Donuts up on 9D. Was there not an issue raised? I don't know if it was raised formally or successfully. Was there not an issue of some endangered species in that case? You have to unmute, Matt.
No, that was the press that did that.
That was what?
The AL's paper, talking about, you know, bats woolly bats and bald eagles, under a Dunkin' Donuts review as if everything was ridiculous. What they failed to report on, was that at that point inside the historic district, everything was a type 1 before, like John said, this change is about 4 or 5 years old. So you did have to fill out the long form. The long form does talk about if there's proximity to any endangered species, right? So it was really just the filling out of a form. Nobody believed that the Dunkin' Donuts, it was impacting bald eagles, but you have to say that you're within it was a distance from from an endangered species, and that was mostly because of the historic district, right, John? That everything got dumped into a type 1.
Correct.
Yeah, so it used to be that we had to, and HDRB at the time wasn't even doing seeker. So when I had joined the planning board, I'm like, we really need to do seeker. Like John said, it's always good to have it in the file, even if it's type 2 exempt. Fill it out, get the form, throw it in the file, right? But yeah, what that was basically filling out the long form seeker. There are questions in there that talk about endangered species. The press picked that up and kind of said, oh, how ridiculous, this bureaucratic nonsense of talking about donuts and bald eagles, right? That's not at all. That's not at all.
Segues into the next, it's a perfect segue. So, yeah, so when you fill out these long form and short form environmental assessment forms, now you do it on the DEC's website. They have something called a resource mapper. And you should make sure that all of the short forms you accept include the maps at the end, because all I have to do is punch in an address or section, block, and lot. And half the questions are answered for me because it goes through various databases. Like, for instance, the endangered species question. It'll probably come up on every single property in the village of Cold Spring because of your proximity to the Hudson River, because of the sturgeon. Now, we all know that you're building something on Main Street is not going to affect the sturgeon, but due to the proximity, it comes up. It's just a database, it's a hit, and it comes up. And I'm assuming that's what Matt was talking about with the paper. It came up because of the proximity to a site maybe a mile away. So you need those environmental assessment forms, whether it's the short form or long form. You use that information that's provided that talks about the endangered species, talks about water usage, sewer usage, traffic. It talks about consistency with comprehensive plan and zoning. Historic district. It has all the information in there. In fact, there's the part 1 where the applicant fills out the qualitative information. Then there's the part 2, which is a bunch of questions that you as the board need to fill out that talk about all those issues. And we'll talk about them more in a little more detail in a second. And then after you answer those questions on the part 2, then you get to the part 3, and that's where you basically say, does this require the preparation of environmental impact statement?
So who goes in to that form? I mean, the applicant is going in and
The applicant fills out part 1, which
Part
is
one.
all the information about the property and the proposal.
right.
And it'll tell you what type of soils are there and how much traffic it's anticipating. And if any hits came up with endangered species, is it close to any historic structures? Was there a hazardous waste site? There's a whole bunch of questions that it answers. And obviously the long form is much more detailed as opposed to the short form.
Okay, but the part 2, which the board.
The board, as an applicant, I always put suggested answers, trying to influence a board, but that's your job. You answer the questions. You do that amongst yourselves, or if you have a consultant, an engineer or an attorney can help you, a planner, if you have a planner, but you as a board have that's your expertise to answer these
Do we
questions.
actually go in and modify the EAF?
The part 1?
No, the part 2.
Yeah, you could check the boxes. I should have brought the forms with me. I apologize.
Okay, but online we can do that?
I mean, so what I do with in some boards, what I do is I'll just read, like on the short form, it's only like 10 questions.
Yeah,
And I'll read the questions for the board and, all right, does this project have any public health or safety concerns? No. Or no, or small. So obviously, anything you do is gonna have some environmental impact. The question is it a significant environmental
yeah,
impact?
no, the question I'm asking is, are you checking a piece of paper in front of you, or are you going online
I'm checking a piece of paper in front of
in
me.
front of you? Okay,
And then there's a third page, the part 3 is where you should be signing that.
okay,
And that is your negative declaration. So the part 1 is filled out by the applicant. The part 2 is the questions, the 10 questions that the board should go through as a board.
mhm,
The part 3 is you just check a box, and again, 9 times out of 10, it's gonna be, we don't need an environmental impact statement, and then you as a chairman, after the board adopts the negative declaration, would sign it.
okay, and, just one more question then, where is this mapping thing that you mentioned?
If you look, it's the New York State DEC Resource Mapper. I just typed that in and it comes up.
Okay,
It's on the DEC's website under secret.
okay, thanks.
So we as a board would get the EAF from the applicant, and then we would spend the meeting talking about our section first.
Mhm.
And then the applicant, which is the same as the lead agency, correct?
You're the lead agency.
Oh, okay, when it's stuff that involves us. the
Yes,
fund.
you're gonna be the lead agency anytime. Well, no, the applicant won't be the lead agency in your situations because they're not an agency, they're a private entity. So you will most likely, in most of your cases, be the lead agency. Your job, they're gonna give you information, your job is to review it. Your job is to essentially agree, confirm the information on the part 1 to make sure it's accurate. Then, once you have all the information you need, go through the questions in part 2. And if you checked off all small or no, then you can just go right to the part 3 and just check a box and say, neg deck. Even if you check off a box, so there's 2 columns, there's the no or small column on these questions, and then there's the yes. You could still check off a yes. Yes, like, will this create traffic impacts? Yes. Then you can do on the part 3, on the 3rd page, there's a little space that you can explain, well, yes, this is large, but because of X, Y, and Z, they're minimized, because of these design, because they're designing in a certain way, it's not gonna be a significant environmental impact. So you can still check yes and get to a neg deck.
All right, well, we often check a yes with historic districts, and what that does, it triggers their review of it. Okay,
So some of the factors and you hit like the historic review. So, it's just like there's a certain criteria for, whether you need an environmental impact statement, you look at certain criteria. Is there a substantial adverse change in air quality, water quality, traffic, noise? Does it involve the removal or destruction of large quantities of vegetation or fauna? These are the type of things that you need to be thinking about as far as, whether this is worthy of a neg deck. Does a material conflict, is there a material conflict with the community's comprehensive plan? Here's the one you probably comes up a lot. This criteria, the impairment of the character or quality of important historical, architectural, or aesthetic resources, or of an existing community or neighborhood character. So that's probably an important one that you guys need to consider when you're, issuing the negative declaration. Does the proposal involve a substantial change in the use or intensity of uses? Like, for instance, are you taking an agricultural farm field and turning it into something else? That's pretty substantial. Are you, taking some type of open space or recreational resource and developing that? That's much different than maybe redeveloping or repurposing an existing site. So those are, the criteria that you kind of look at, and again, it's for your purposes. In most cases, you're gonna have a short form EAF, and there's the 10 questions on the part 2. Those are the questions you guys should go through together as a board. And again, even if you check yes on a couple of them, if you do, you just need to explain, well, this is a yes, but it doesn't rise to the level of a significant environmental impacts because of X, Y, and Z. Whatever that is. So you should kind of document anytime you check yes, just document why it still doesn't trigger an environmental impact statement or significant environmental impact. So, and that's the agent, that's what they call a hard look. You have to take a hard look, and that's what the cases talk about. So you have to identify relevant areas of environmental concern. In your case, a lot of it's going to be historic, community character. Those are probably the big ones, right? I mean, not so much vehicle traffic, but maybe pedestrian traffic. All right, and then thoroughly analyze those areas to determine if the action may have it. Remember, it's got to be a significant adverse impact. Any type of development is going to have an adverse impact on the environment. I mean, no matter what you do, the question is it significant? That's what triggers an environmental impact statement. And then you need to support your determination with reasoned elaboration. So again, even if you check a yes, you can still issue a neg deck, but you have to say, we're checking yes here, but it doesn't rise to the level of a significant environmental impact because of X, Y, and Z, whatever that may be. Right, and if you do have an action that will cause a significant adverse environmental impact, that's what they call as a positive declaration. As a developer, it's not positive because that's bad news. And that triggers an environmental impact statement, which doesn't mean you can't build the project. It just means you've got to do a more thorough analysis, which usually takes about a year, if you're lucky. And then if you have it, again, if it doesn't cause a significant adverse environmental impact, that's what you call a negative declaration. So it's in the negative. There's a couple of cases that I kind of cited in the back. Matt, I thought you'd like this one, the Adirondack Historical Association versus Lake Placid. I don't know if you're up by Lake Placid.
Yep, just a few minutes away, yep.
So there was a case from the 3rd Department. Increased traffic congestion, other potential traffic impacts associated with a proposed condemnation, but they never addressed the traffic concern.
Yeah.
So
A village with terrible traffic problems.
So here, I think the issue here is they never did a traffic study. I mean, you can still do a traffic study and so the applicant's going to come in, they're going to have an engineer, they have a traffic engineer, they're going to do a study. Then you need to retain your own engineer, traffic engineer to review. Right. So and then you have the battle of the experts, so to speak. And then, so, you got to make sure, and that's why you got to make sure you don't miss something. You got to go through all the questions to make sure you don't miss something, because that makes it easy to overturn, because how could you take a hard look at something if there's no, if you don't have any analysis?
If a traffic study, here's a hypothetical for you, if a traffic study is carried out and it is based on findings from other sources, but those sources aren't referenced. Is that considered a hard look, or if you simply accept data with, and the public must accept data without a reference?
So if an applicant is doing, a developer is doing a traffic study, it'll have all the references, because these guys will.
And those records should be available, correct?
Yeah, but you're gonna have your own traffic, you're gonna hire your own traffic engineer and.
We could afford one.
Well, no, but the applicant will pay for it.
Oh,
So you have, even, you don't have any, you shouldn't have any money out of pocket.
well,
Right.
that's interesting. That's what I agree with you 100%, but that's what should be happening here. Okay.
But we don't have but we don't have an applicant,
What?
but we don't have an applicant.
Yes, we
don't have an
do.
applicant.
Oh, no, we don't. We, the planning.
Yeah.
One more question, John. At the very beginning of it, I don't know, I can't remember this term. You mentioned in terms of impact that, something that was contiguous or
Substantially contiguous. Substantially. contiguous.
substantially contiguous.
Mhm.
But then toward the end of this, we're talking about proximity, which is it's a slightly different term. Because you can be proximate to something without being substantially continuous with it.
Yeah, and you could still impact a historic structure that you're in proximity to,
Right.
even though you're not substantially contiguous.
Okay, so that term is a term of art that's been accepted, in other words, proximity. Okay. All righty. Questions?
No questions. This is great. Thank you.
It was really great.
Yeah.
Questions? Sue?
No, I have just a background question because of the Butterfield Hospital thing. When we were looking at their final building and when we were discussing that, then we had the secret type 2 and that was done. But what was happening before that? Because it was a hospital site and everything. What was the secret report or process for the first phase or for the earlier phase?
Well, Matt can.
Matt can probably tell you
Matt
better
can
than
tell
I
you
can.
that.
but I don't think they did it.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It wasn't segmented. It was an EAS. It was a, and so they did a full EAS.
Okay.
They did a long form.
Yeah, it didn't have to go to EIS, but it's an extensive study. It's a
I don't think they did it EIS.
correct. Yeah, but it was an extensive EAS.
Right, yeah, sometimes I work so hard as an applicant to get a neg deck and you provide all this information. And at the end of the day, I should have just did the EIS because it still took me 18 months to get where I wanted to be, but I still think there's advantages to get the neg deck.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll give Laura the advice about to just read through. Does she need to self-certify or something that she did?
No, it's just, if she just sends an email saying to Jeff, just saying, hey, I reviewed.
Okay, that's great. And thank you for coming out in this hideous weather.
Oh, no problem.
And thank you all. Is anyone from the public on?
No.
No, okay. So, if I can have a resolution to adjourn, please.
Should we just go? I just want to make sure we cover everything on the agenda. Do we have any reports of members?
No.
No. We have
Nope.
no correspondence. No old business, no new business, and no public, so.
Thank you. Now,
There you- Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn. Thank you, Matt, and second.
A second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous, no no's, no abstention. All right, Pete.
Happy holidays. Stay safe, everybody.
Nice seeing everybody. Everybody have a great holiday.
Have a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Okay,